those affected by mitochondrial disorders, UMDF is here for you. Since 1996, we've worked to provide support, fund research, and create awareness.
Our mission is to promote research for cures and treatments of these diseases and to give support to affected families.
We want future generations to grow up in a world without mitochondrial disease.
I'm playing for the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation.
Look at that. Nice check for you.
Over the years, our community has grown and our message has sparked a movement.
Hey everybody, it's Maya Mialik. Have you ever heard of mitochondrial disease?
Together, we've been able to make a difference for patient families around the world. Today, we are helping thousands of people navigate their mitochondrial disease journey. We're here, listening and providing support. We're here, educating and connecting patients and healthcare providers. We're here, finding and funding the best cutting-edge research. We will not rest until we find a cure. Join the movement at umdf.org.
All right, well, welcome everybody to Ask the Mito Doc, our January 2021 webcast. I am Phil Yeski, the Science and Alliance Officer here at UMDF. I'm going to be serving dual roles tonight. I'll be moderating the webcast, but also speaking for a bit as well. So we really look forward to covering a couple of topics tonight. I'm going to talk briefly about patient registries, and then we're going to bring Dr. Bruce Cohen on from Akron Children's Hospital to talk about clinical trials. And so that'll be tonight's program. So it's in typical form. We're going to use the Q&A function for submitting questions. So please don't put it into chat. It won't be read by us. So Q&A, if you have a question you'd like to submit, and we'll do our best to get to that tonight. And obviously anything that we can't cover during the webcast, we'll try to follow up with individuals as well. Of course, we do want to thank our sponsors who make this possible, specifically the Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust, Tishcon Corporation, Summit Health Pharmacy, and Cyclerion Therapeutics. Thank you to our sponsors who do make programming like this possible for UMDF. Of course, we're in 2021 now, and this is a really big milestone year for our foundation. It's the 25th anniversary. We've developed this spiffy logo for our 25th year, so you'll be seeing it a lot of our presentations this year. We really want to celebrate it in as many ways as possible. And we know that's challenging given what's going on. Maybe on the next slide, we can talk about some of the things we're doing here in our 25th year. So in the late last year, we posted or released our new website. And hopefully you've all had a chance to check that out at umdf.org. You see right up top a lot of the changes that took place. And one of the things we really want to emphasize are important programs like Mito U, which is new to UMDF relatively, and COVID-19 updates. So Mito U is a perfect place where if for whatever reason tonight you want to go back, revisit this webcast, those are all available on demand through Mito U. We also have a lot of programming for clinicians there. So if any clinicians are on, or you want to make your Mito Doc aware of Mito U, we have lots of programming for that as well. We're still hoping to be able to have Mitochondrial Medicine 2021 in person so we can celebrate that silver anniversary in person. Save the dates, June 23rd to 26th in Charlotte, North Carolina, if it's in person. But of course, we are planning a number of contingencies depending on how the pandemic plays out here in the coming months. It may be virtual, it may be hybrid. So we'll continue to provide information to you about that as we become more certain about our plans. Very important part of UMDF are Energy for Life walks, and given the pandemic, that has really forced our development team to pivot to a virtual model. They've done a great job with it. I encourage everyone participate in a virtual Energy for Life walk near you, if possible. You can find all of those listed at energyforlifewalk.org. But even if there's not one near you, you can virtually participate in any of them. This is still a critical component of UMDF and its ability to continue to provide mission to this disease community. And then just foreshadowing the next Ask the Mito Doc webcast, that will be focused on COVID-19. And we know that this is a really top priority, sort of front of mind for everyone right now. A number of questions that came in advance of tonight's webcast touched on COVID-19, and maybe they were directed more towards the February webcast. We'll do the best we can to weave that in tonight as well. We certainly don't want to make anyone wait to get the important questions answered, but there will be a dedicated webcast to COVID-19 on February 16th. So please mark your calendars for that. You can see the panelists that will be involved. It's really an esteemed group of clinicians, that both pediatric and adults, that should be able to answer all the questions you might have around vaccination in particular. All right, well, I think with that, we're ready to move into tonight's programming. Again, it's going to be a two-part. I'm going to stay on the platform and talk a little bit about patient registries, and then I will hand it over to Dr. Cohen. So in terms of patient registry update, I really wanted to start with a slide I've been using actually for a number of years, but I think it's really important to continually reinforce this. Our interest is ensuring that therapeutic development that takes place for mitochondrial disease is patient-centered. And as such, we think that UMDF is a perfect organization to serve as a central steward. And when I talk about therapeutic development, it's really an ecosystem, right? It's not about what UMDF can do itself. It's about how a lot of moving parts, a lot of different stakeholders all work together. And some of those you see listed around this bubble with therapeutic development at the center. So when we start talking about government agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the FDA, that's about funding the research that makes therapeutic development possible. And it's also about the regulatory control of the therapeutics that are in development. So two very important agencies. We also work with the Department of Defense to provide another source of funding for research grants. Of course, we work very closely with researchers in both academia and pharma institutions like Mayo Clinic, and with one of the sponsors tonight, Cyclerion, to ensure that as they're developing their clinical trials, we're working to ensure that the endpoints, that the populations are ready to be recruited into those clinical trials. Biobanks are a very important part of therapeutic development, and I think we'll have more to say about that in the future, about how we can create more robust biobanking around mitochondrial disease. Mayo Clinic really helps us on that front right now. There are a number of clinical research networks that participate, so this is where clinician researchers share data. It might be genomic data, it might be health data, but it's really about working together to find the most important results inside of those data that will advance the development of therapies. And then I have engaged patient community, and I've listed 3 organizations that partnered on a patient-focused drug development meeting back in 2019. An engaged patient community requires a robust system of patient advocacy groups and individuals to ensure that the patient community is involved in therapeutic development. But what I really want to just spend a few minutes talking about tonight are patient-populated registries and where they fit in this ecosystem. Again, our goal as UMDF is to serve as a central steward. And we chose that word steward very carefully. It's not about owning the data or controlling the data. It's really about ensuring that we're collecting the right data, protecting those data, and using them in an appropriate way in our shared goal of developing those treatments and cures that we all want to see come from mitochondrial disease. So let me talk about what UMDF has been doing with regards to patient-populated registries. I think most of you probably are aware already, we've actually been running a registry for the last 5-6 years called the Mitochondrial Disease Community Registry. During that time, we collected a lot of data, but what we thought was most interesting in the outcome was the free text that was provided. the answers to questions like what's most important to you? What would you want to share with your clinicians? And so my co-author, Sophia Zilber, and I, went through all of those data and put a paper together that was published in March of last year. And that really represented a perfect opportunity to kind of close that stage of the registry. It was time to move on to what's next. Really important outcomes, and I encourage you to read this paper. We have it available on the UMDF website. But pretty shortly after that, we knew it was time to start planning for what's the next phase. So we closed MDCR, and we started working on a completely new registry that will be on a new software program. And we're referring to that as Mitoshare. And the idea of Mitoshare, as you can probably tell from the name, it's really a broad initiative to encourage patients to share health, genomic, biosample together data in one place. And really the sharing extends to you yourself as a person to be involved in clinical trials as well. So it's a broad initiative around that. Its primary goal, very focused. We didn't necessarily have this goal whenever we started MDCR. With Mitoshare, we want to make it clear. Our primary goal with this patient registry is to facilitate the development of treatments and cures, because we know we've been listening to the feedback received. This is what's most important to the patient community. We want to make sure we're providing programming that meets those needs. So how do we do that? Of course, we have to identify and characterize as many mitochondrial disease patients as possible. So that's really the basis, the core of the registry, is finding ways to encourage you to sign up, be a part of that registry, and ask you the right kinds of questions or ask you to provide the right kind of data that will help us to better characterize the mitochondrial disease patients. So as clinical trials come, we know where those patients are, we know who they are. And another important use of this database will be building out what's known as natural history, which is really the progression of the disease over time, but from the patient perspective. So natural history studies take place within clinician populated databases all the time, some of which we saw on that previous slide. We want to do it from the patient side. What are the sorts of data that patients can provide and give an indication of how disease changes over time? These are really important insights as clinical trials are being developed to ensure that companies are working on what's most important to the patients. They're not solving problems that the patient community would look at and say, that's not really what's most important to me. So we need to collect data to better understand those needs. So how will we do that? Well, any registry, and particularly one that's focused on therapeutic development, is really a spectrum activity. It begins with identifying the patients, engaging them, enrolling them in the registry. It moves on to a phase of collecting data, managing the data appropriately. Very importantly then, though, we want to make sure that we've created a registry in an environment where research can take place using the data. And so we're incorporating that into our overall process and infrastructure as well. And then, of course, it's about remaining engaged or keeping the participants engaged, presenting new surveys and new opportunities, research opportunities on a continued basis, so that we're constantly adding and growing that database. A patient populated registry is really one of the most important assets a disease community can have in that quest to develop treatments and cures. So that's our overall goal with Mitoshare. We're going to be telling you a lot more about this as we get closer to the launch of it. We're making great progress with building it out. Some of you may have even been involved in some beta testing that we've done around natural history studies. There will be much more to share with you. And of course, my colleague, Katarina Gray, is going to serve as the registry coordinator. We'll be sure to have her come on to a future Ask the Mito Doc as well to just talk about the process of getting signed up and what's involved with it. But for tonight, I just wanted to end there and reinforce the importance of patient registries and assure you that UMDF recognizes the responsibility we have, right, to first create that program, but also steward it in a sustainable way. So I will end there. We want to make sure we leave plenty of time for the discussion of clinical trials that are taking place and also any COVID questions. So I'm just going to exit out of my presentation and move over to Dr. Cohen's. And it's my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Bruce Cohen, who's going to talk about a clinical trial update. Bruce.
Great, thanks, Phil. It's great to be here tonight. I too am celebrating my 25th anniversary with the UMDF. I think I've been around since a few months after the UMDF formed. So it's great here tonight to be here tonight talking to you about clinical trial update. And first question is, what is a clinical trial? Well, these are human trials where we investigate whether a treatment that we give it makes people's lives better. And that's what a clinical trial is. And some of the things that I want to talk to you tonight about is how we judge effectiveness of a therapy, our vitamins and supplements of therapy, proper clinical trial design, and some current clinical trials that are going on in mitochondrial disease. Go to the next slide. Now, I've been around clinical trials my entire career. I began performing clinical trials in brain tumors in 1987. So I've been doing this 33, 34 years. It's hard to believe it's been that long. And I'm going to refer to my career in brain tumors several times during this talk. And you'll understand why as the talk evolves. But really for the last 20 years or so, it's when I started first poking my toe into the water for clinical trials in mitochondrial disease. So the first question is, with any trial, how do we judge effectiveness? And the first level of effectiveness is an individual benefit. And that's, we diagnose a child as having a mitochondrial disease. We give the child a therapy, let's say it's coenzyme Q10, and the parents report a benefit. And let's say that benefit's sustained. That's what we call an N of 1. N is how many people you treated, and 1 is the single patient treated. And that's called a case report. And if you publish it, it enters into the literature. And it ends up that case reports have a very little, it's the lowest level of evidence that any treatment would work. And up until very recently, the literature was filled with single case reports or small case reports representing or demonstrating benefit. For the most part, most of our vitamins and supplements that we give our patients today we do so based on the collection of these individual case reports and small case reports in mitochondrial disease. And when we go to the bigger types of studies, it appears that most of the vitamins and cofactors have either failed to demonstrate benefit or absolutely haven't demonstrated a benefit in a meaningful way. This doesn't mean we don't use vitamins and cofactors, but we don't view them as definitive treatments for mitochondrial diseases. The second level of effectiveness is where we treat a series of patients under a standard condition with the medication, and we publish that in a peer-reviewed journal. So we treat 20 patients with a vitamin or a medication. There's no placebo, and we publish the results of that, and that's called a case series. And the benefits of a case series is you're treating patient after patient, and it's a little more meaningful than a individual case series, but still not what is considered strong evidence. For the most part, there are no drugs in the United States that have been approved for treatment of any disease based on individual benefit or case series. Now, there are some glaring exceptions to that. There was a drug approved for a very rare metabolic disease based on a case series of 4 patients. But these type of drugs it's rare for that to happen, and it only happens under some very rare, ultra rare disorders. The types of trials we're involved in right now are randomized clinical trials. Let me explain what that means. In almost all these experiments, we're comparing the therapy versus a placebo. You can also do a therapy versus another therapy, but since we don't have any approved therapies for mitochondrial disease, all of our current trials include the use of a placebo. The drug is given in what's called the double-blinded fashion. That means that neither the investigator knows if the patient's getting placebo or therapy, nor does the patient know if they're getting placebo or therapy. Often we'll add what's called a crossover in this type of trial, meaning that on day one, half the patients will start with placebo, the other half will start with the therapy. That will continue for about 3 months, is just an example. And then for a month after that, everyone goes on placebo. And then a month later, those who were getting placebo enter a 3-month therapy phase, and those that were getting therapy in the first 3 months enter a continuation of the placebo phase. And then at the end of that 7 months, you look and see whether the medication was better than the placebo. We'll often add what we call an open label extension. So at the end of 7 months, if you'd like to, everyone goes on the active therapy, and data in terms of outcomes are collected on that open label extension. One of the key points is that we have to have an outcome measure, and this is referred to as a primary endpoint. And this outcome measure needs to be clinically relevant and able to be tested for in an objective way. So let me give you some examples of primary endpoints in clinical trials. Let's take a diabetes trial. A primary endpoint may be blood sugar control. In a high blood pressure trial, the primary endpoint would be blood pressure control. In a brain tumor trial, the primary endpoint may be 5-year survival. In all these examples I just gave you, the primary endpoint is objective, it's easy to measure, and there really is no discussion as to whether or not it's a relevant number. In the blood pressure control, blood pressure is relevant. In a diabetes trial, blood sugar is relevant. In a brain tumor trial, being alive at the end of 5 years is relevant. And one of the things that we've had a real difficult time in mitochondrial disease is trying to define a measurable primary endpoint that's clinically relevant. Next slide. Now, we're going to get back to endpoints in a little bit, but I want to talk about the development phase of these drugs. The drug is first discovered. This sometimes happens by accident, and sometimes happens by design. I don't want to spend too much time into some of the examples, but some of these drugs are developed with a plan in mind on how to make mitochondria work better. So the drug is first discovered, and then it enters what's called preclinical development. And this means pre-human development. So this drug may be tested in a test tube to see if it improves mitochondrial function in cells. And then it can be tested in animals. When tested in animals, we're looking for toxicity, and we're also looking for whether the drug works or not. There are some animal models of mitochondrial disease. These are not perfect models. They don't replicate human disease perfectly, but it's better than nothing. The first human trials are generally done in healthy people, but not always. And these are called phase 1 trials, where we're primarily looking for the maximum tolerated dose. We're looking for toxicity, and these trials will often, you'll start with a very low dose in 5 people, look for toxicity, and then you'll increase the dose for the next 5 people, then increase the dose for the next 5 people, and so forth and so on until you reach what's called a maximum tolerated dose. In cancer trials, phase 1 trials are generally not done in healthy people. They're done in people that are really at the end of their life in terms of their cancer. So these are people that are expected to die within a few months, and they will enter into phase 1 trials basically as a gift to the next person with the disease. It's rare for phase 1 trials to result in any one person being cured. We're doing a dose seeking human experiment. Phase 2 trials explore whether or not this drug has a chance of working. So generally in phase 2 trials, there's one dose of medication being used, and you'll try that medication in 20 or 30 or 40 people and see if it affects that primary endpoint that you've chosen. In a phase 3 trial is you're testing the drug against a placebo or some other standard of care. These generally are larger trials. With each trial phase, the trial becomes more and more expensive. You can do a phase 1 trial on 15 patients. The phase 2 trial is going to cost you 5 times as much to do because you're going to be treating 20 patients over a much longer period of time. And phase 3 trials are ultra expensive to do. And then if the phase 3 trial shows that the drug actually works against that primary endpoint, you go for regulatory approval. In the United States, this is known as FDA approval. Next slide. So this is what's called a Kaplan-Meier graph. It's a brain tumor trial. And again, as I said, I spent the first 25 years of my career extensively involved in literally dozens of these trials. And each of these curves represents a different treatment. And on the bottom, you can see years following surgery. These are actually death curves. And with treatment A, which is biopsy of the brain tumor alone, you can see that by 9 months, every person in the trial has passed away of the disease. Treatment B was remove as much of the tumor as you possibly can. And you can see that the outcome of patients treated with extensive surgery is better than with biopsy alone. But really, by the end of 2 years, 90% of the people have succumbed to the disease. Treatment C is that extensive removal of the tumor plus X-ray therapy, radiation therapy. And the curve is bumped a little bit to the right, obviously better than B, but it drags out survival of the patients several months to approximately a year. But you can see even at 3 years, over 90% of the people has succumbed to the disease. And treatment D is surgery plus radiation therapy plus chemotherapy. And what you can see is a treatment effect of adding chemotherapy, so that at 4 years and beyond, approximately 10% of the people survive. Now, this is not a disease that anyone would want to have. It is not, no one's slapping each other on the back saying, hey, we made it. Even with the best treatment, the most intensive treatment, there's still a 90% chance of dying of the disease. But if you make it to 4 years, you probably are going to survive. Now, the thing about doing clinical trials in the disease that's called glioblastoma is that these curves are very well defined. In this trial, you can see that 184 patients got the chemotherapy, but there have been hundreds of these trials done. And so literally tens of thousands of patients have been treated in these manners, and we really know the outcome with very solid amount of evidence. And the primary endpoint is survival. And so that's something, again, easy to measure because there's no doubt about what survival is following brain tumor surgery. So the next slide. We're not so lucky in mitochondrial diseases in trying to define these primary endpoints. And I'll get to that in a minute. One of the questions that's coming up in my research institute is that we're spending all this time doing mitochondrial trials. COVID-19, none of us had even heard of it a year ago, or we were just hearing about it. how do we have vaccines that seem to be working? How were they developed so readily? Number one, the scope of the illness is very different. Mitochondrial disease is still a rare disease. It's an orphan disease. And because the scope of the illness was really the billions of people on the face of the earth, all the governments poured all the resources into trying to develop these vaccines that for a disease that was highly lethal. 4% of people who got COVID died within a month of onset. The second thing is the regulatory agencies cut through all the red tape, and all the government agencies basically form contracts with the vaccine makers to guarantee payment and pre-purchase the drugs. The next point is that vaccine development for vaccine for SARS-2 spike protein, which is similar to the COVID-19 spike protein, actually started 14 years ago. So people have been working on this type of virus for a long time. And the reason no one has developed an mRNA virus against the spike protein type viruses is because the vaccines were thought to have to be frozen at minus 80 degrees centigrade. And there wasn't a vaccine maker in the world that thought that that could be done on a large scale. So the COVID-19 story is an example of what can happen if you pour resources into a problem. Unfortunately for us in the mitochondrial disease field, fortunately, we don't have billions of people with mitochondrial disease. Unfortunately, it's hard to get all this happening when you're talking about thousands of potential patients, and not more. So I wanted to throw that slide in to sort of set the stage of what can happen if you really pour all your resources into a problem. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about primary endpoints in mitochondrial disease. To get a drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration, you've got to convince them that not only is your drug safe, but it actually improves some important aspect of a patient's day-to-day living. The first primary endpoint that we started with the drug EPI 743, we used a scale developed in Newcastle, England, called the Newcastle Mitochondrial Disease Pediatric Scale. This was the disease severity scale. And it gave us a number. We could apply the scale to any patient on any day and come up with a number. And we chose as the primary endpoint in many of these early trials, the Newcastle scale. Unfortunately, the drug didn't change the scale score enough to convince anyone, both the doctors doing the trials as well as the FDA, that was a significant enough change to warrant drug approval. Some more recent studies, drugs that we've tried, we've used the 6-minute walk test. This is a test to see how many yards a patient can walk in a 6-minute period of time. And actually, on the surface, this seems like a great primary endpoint to see if a drug works. If someone's having trouble walking because of the mitochondrial disease, you give them a medication. You use that medication for several months. If the drug is effective, you'll be able to measure it on a 6-minute walk test. And again, that's an objective test that we've used. Right now, we're in a trial using that same drug to see if it works for epilepsy. And our primary endpoint in that drug trial is change from baseline to week 24 in the number of observable motor seizures in a 28-day period. So baseline, someone is having 50 motor seizures in a 28-day period. And at the end of 24 weeks, which is, about a half a year, they're no longer having 50 seizures a month, but they're having 20 seizures a month. That would be probably a significant improvement in seizures and would meet the the goal of the study. There's some problems with the 6-minute walk test that we're hoping to overcome with a test called the 12-minute walk test. We always look in early drug development for adverse event profiles. An adverse event is something like a hospitalization. Do you end up on a respirator during the trial period? Do you have more falls? Do you require surgery? Those are what are adverse events. There's one trial that's being planned right now to treat Pearson syndrome, which is a mitochondrial disease, where blood is not being made appropriately because of the mitochondrial disease. And an endpoint is just the hemoglobin level, how much blood is actually in your system. So these are endpoints in trial design. What the FDA is not interested in is whether or not the MRI scan gets better. That's not considered something that's truly relevant to the patient. Yes, we would like the MRI scan to get better, but if they're not able to walk faster or not able to do better on any particular chosen test, it doesn't really matter if the MRI is better or not better. So that's something that we're cognizant of. And one of the other factors in choosing primary endpoints is the FDA wants you to choose one or two. The more primary endpoints you choose, the more expensive your trial becomes. And something that every single trial is up against is a budget, because these companies have only so much money to run these trials. Next slide. So we do have some obstacles in mitochondrial disease development. The first is that we have many diseases. When we talk about brain tumors in adults as an example, or brain tumors in children, we have basically 4 or 5 diseases that we're up against. With mitochondrial diseases, obviously dozens. We don't have outcome measures that are readily or easy to evaluate. Our 6-minute walk test has not been a particularly robust outcome measure. Or the drugs just haven't allowed people to walk better. So we have not solved the outcome measure problem. Mitochondrial diseases have long and unpredictable courses. The example I showed you with the malignant brain tumor has a short and very predictable clinical course. We know what happens if you don't get adequate treatment. The other thing about mitochondrial disease is there's swings in function with prolonged periods of disease and activity. We have plenty of patients with mitochondrial disease that get sick, have a diagnosed illness, and then don't progress for months or years. And when you have that lack of progression, it makes it difficult to prove a drug would make you better. We have a difficulty in getting an adequate number of patients to meet entry criteria. That's because it's a rare disease. There are some statistical considerations with low numbers of patients that make it difficult to prove a drug works. These studies, we would like to carry them on longer. So, we talk about a 24-week trial. I'd love it to be a 48-week trial. There's just not enough money to continue collecting data for a 48-week trial. That's why it happens to, be a 24-week trial. So, the costs are involved and there's travel involved as well, because the way these trials work, they can only be done at a few medical centers, partially because of costs, partially because of the expertise that it doesn't really exist at every hospital in the country. Next slide. So I think this is the slide where the rubber hits the road, and we're going to, I'm not going to go into detail about all these drugs, but just a few of them. The dark blue on the slide indicates drugs that are in active or have been in active clinical development. The first one I want to mention is the drug alamipritide, Stealth Biotherapeutics. We ran 5 different alamipritide trials from primary mitochondrial myopathy. The last trial, which was trial number 301, failed to show a change in the primary endpoint that would convince anyone that this drug was useful. Interestingly enough, there were a group of patients with one disease in the trial design that did quite well. And had the trial been done only on that one disease, the drug probably would have been able to get approved by the FDA. But because the group as a whole did not do well, did not benefit, the trial was considered as not meeting the primary endpoint. The company is looking into a new trial looking at just that single one mitochondrial disease. The drug is actually doing well in a subset of a mitochondrial disease called Barth syndrome, which is an ultra rare disease involving a constituent of the inner mitochondrial membrane called cardiolipin. And that drug is nearing the end of development. And my hope is that it will get FDA approved for Barth syndrome. A company called GenSight is doing a gene therapy trial in Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. Dr. Peter Stackpool at University of Florida is doing a clinical trial using a drug called dichloroacetate for the disease pyruvate dehydrogenase, PDH. Pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency causes about 10% of Lee syndrome. And this is a drug that has been around for longer than I've been involved in mitochondrial medicine. And it's finally seen the light of day in a clinical trial. So they're collecting data for that trial. That trial has been delayed a couple of years for a variety of different reasons, including not being able to get a hold of the drug in the first place. And then it got delayed because of COVID-19, but it's now up and running. And finally, the drug that originally started out with the name EPI-743 and now called PTC-743 is an active clinical trial for refractive epilepsy and mitochondrial disease, enrolling patients under 18 years of age and under. The other drugs listed here are approaching clinical trial. Reneo, REN-1001, the Astellas compound, are two drugs that are nearing clinical trial entry. These will be recruiting adults with mitochondrial myopathy, muscle weakness. And then there's other drugs that are being developed as well that hopefully will be close to clinical trial entry. I think some of the reason there are some delays has to do with COVID-19. It's really difficult to open a clinical trial in the first place, and to try to do it in the face of COVID-19 when people have to travel. You know, the thought of getting on an airplane would be terrifying to me, but hopefully less so in 3 months when plenty of people are vaccinated. So I think this is my last slide and ready for questions. So
right.
Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Cohen. Why don't we turn on our cameras now? And hello again, everyone. Nice to see you. Dr. Cohen's going to join me, and we have about 15 minutes or so left in the webcast to just try to address some of the questions that came in during the webcast or prior to it. Again, we're really trying to focus on clinical trials and aspects of therapeutic development, but we'll do the best we can to weave as many of these as possible into the Q&A. Let me start here, actually, Bruce, and I don't know if just to kind of keep it on this slide for a second, because I think this is one of those slides, and I'm the person that put this together, right? So I know it's a lot of information to absorb, but there are some really hopeful outcomes from this, right? From this slide. First of all, you talked about 10 years ago, a decade ago, one company, right? Edison with EPI-743. Now I think we have 12 companies listed on here. And I can share with this audience that I've been in conversation with dozens of others that are in that discovery or preclinical planning phase, thinking about what opportunities might exist around mitochondrial disease. It really is an exciting time for the community. And I think our message is, it's why it's so important that we know where the patients are and we have them well characterized. I hope you'd agree with that.
Absolutely. I mean, again, 10 years ago, we were having conversations with one company, and now, um, one of our concerns is we won't have enough patients for clinical trials when all these drugs enter the clinical trial phase.
Yeah, and
So,
that of course would be a real shame. There's a window of opportunity when companies are developing drugs where we need to recruit those trials. But I think it's a well-established fact that still the most common reason that a drug fails during clinical research in a clinical trial is lack of enrollment. So this is the part we can play, right? Kind of speaking to the patient community here is to be ready, to be watching, sign up for registries, participate in research. And when these trials open, be willing to share yourself and be a part of that. It's as much for you as it is for future generations of mitochondrial disease patients. It's an extremely selfless act to be involved in it without any guarantee of benefit, but it's the only way we will get to treatments and cures. So I just wanted to go back and kind of look at the range of mitochondrial disease indications, both adult and pediatric, many different mechanisms of action, meaning there's a lot of different ways that companies are thinking about drug development for mitochondria. So that's on the plus side. And you listed all the challenges with it as well. But I think overall, this is a very hopeful picture that comes out of this pipeline. It's one of the questions to kind of get to the point that was posed is, when can we expect some solid therapeutic outcomes, options for mitochondrial disease patients? You mentioned these clinical trials take time. What's reasonable expectations for us to see approved drugs for mitochondrial disease?
so for the drug that had been known as EPI 743 and now known as PTC 743, it's the same drug, just a change of company. That drug is in a phase 3 clinical trial right now. If the enrollment goes well, and again, we're faced with COVID-19, so the enrollment is probably slower than it had hoped to have been. We should have the enough patients enrolled, I would say, within 18 months. And again, because the outcome measure is easy to define, whether it works or not is a different story, but we can count seizures. And the FDA has been talking with the company about this drug now for over 10 years. So the FDA is familiar with the drug. The safety profile is well worked out. It's a safe medication. Let's say that the end of 2022, we have an answer, and let's say that answer is a good answer. You probably add 6 months to it before it hits the market.
So a matter of a couple years, perhaps.
Yeah, 2 years, 2.5 years.
Right. And that's, of course, a therapeutic intervention, as you said, the FDA is very familiar with. And there are many other types of drugs, and some of them aren't even, we have gene therapies listed here. There was a question about using gene editing, such as some of these CRISPR techniques. Right? I think we have to set some expectations around the time it takes to bring new technologies and new drugs to market. That's not going to happen in a matter of 1 or 2 years, is it? They're going to have much longer development cycles to develop those types of drugs.
Yep.
So I think there was an important question in here, Dr. Cohen, that we should speak to. How does a patient get involved in a clinical trial? They see something, I could be a candidate for that. What's the best way for them to get involved?
So number one, the UMDF website is going to be a source for new clinical trials in mitochondrial disease. But if you want to check it out yourself, there is a website called clinicaltrials.gov, and it's easy to use. You can type in mitochondria or mitochondrial in the search engine, and it'll tell you all the clinical trials that are available. It'll also tell you all the clinical trials that are closed as well. You get a little too much information from that website. But it is up to date. It's meant to be up to date, and it may take you to a trial in Germany that just becomes the trials, if it's a trial being run in China, it'll be on clinicaltrials.gov. It's not applicable to you unless you want to haul yourself off to China, which again is not going to be happening probably. So it's U.S. based, but it does other countries register their trials on there as well.
Yeah,
but the UMDF will have trials relevant to mitochondrial patients in the U.S.
So two really important resources there, and actually, I'm going to ask our co-hosts here in the background if they wouldn't mind just putting in the link for the UMDF website for the /research. So that's where we list all the ongoing clinical trials. And from that page, we have direct links to clinicaltrials.gov, where you can get the additional details about the trial, explore the enrollment criteria, see if you're eligible. But even from there, the next step is really reaching out and contacting one of the participating sites and investigators, right, Dr. Cohn?
Yep. Yeah. So when you get to the trial on clinicaltrials.gov, it'll show the hospitals that are involved, and it will have phone numbers and email addresses. And so you can do contacting yourself directly. You don't need to be referred into a clinical trial. Obviously, it's easier if the doctor talks to a doctor, but many of our patients contact us directly, and that's how we get our patients involved in clinical trials.
And of course, tonight, I talked about another important pathway to finding patients for clinical trials, and that's we know who you are and we know what condition you're afflicted with. That's what a patient registry does. So as we spin up the new version of the patient registry, if for no other reason, please sign up, become a part of that. That's how we'll be able to assess, here's a clinical trial ready to get started that you could be a good candidate for. We obviously, UMDF's not in a position to tell you you can participate in the clinical trial, but we can make you aware of the opportunity. Then it's a discussion between you, your healthcare provider, and the investigators that are involved in that clinical trial. But that's how we stay in communication. You can advocate for yourself, but also UMDF can facilitate it if we have a way to contact you. And that's one of the prime reasons that we want to get our patient registry up and running as soon as possible. Bruce, maybe with 5 minutes or so to go here, we ought to spend a little bit of time also talking about COVID, right? And some of the questions that have come in are COVID related, not surprisingly, with a particular emphasis on the vaccines, right, that are just coming out. And I was just looking at a New York Times resource over here that there's, I believe, something like 80 vaccines in development right now in the world. It's an incredible number. And I believe some 20 of those are in advanced stages of clinical trials. And we know there are 2 already approved here in the United States and more on the way. This provides a lot of options for our mitochondrial disease community, but it also raises a lot of questions, I think, within the patient community. Can you briefly speak to thoughts on generally for mitochondrial disease patients or those with metabolic disorders, the importance of being vaccinated, but also considerations before you move forward with getting a specific vaccine?
So I've instructed my staff when they asked me, do you want us just to tell all your patients who call that you want them to get a vaccine? And I said, no, I'd like to handle each call individually. And then they pushed back and they said, are you going to tell any of them no? And I said, well, I don't know if I'm going to tell any of them no until I, think about their particular individual case. So the way I'm handling it is I want to hear from each of my patients. If they want to call me, I'm going to consider each case separately. I do have one patient that has had some very unusual reactions to vaccination, where we're actually able to prove something was going on with it, and so that's one case where I've said, hold off on the vaccine until I get some other people's expert opinion, and I've been calling around to try to get that expert opinion.
It really is impossible to give a universal answer to this question. And,
Yep.
of course, we're receiving inquiries almost every day around this now. Dr. Cohen is the chair of our Scientific and Medical Advisory Board, and we work with the SMAB to develop a position statement or at least some guidelines for the mitochondrial disease community. And first and foremost, focus on not getting sick. All right. So appropriate mask usage and social distancing. These are the most important things you can do to avoid getting sick. The vaccine is really an important layer right on top of that. But our guidelines are very clear. It's really an individual decision between healthcare provider and patient as to the appropriateness of being vaccinated at all and what specific vaccine.
Yep. So for the most part, what I'm telling really all the patients so far is that yes, you're an adult. You're an adult. I do want you vaccinated because I think the risk of getting COVID-19 are obvious. And the sicker you are, the more likely you're going to have a problem with COVID-19.
And that's a really important point too. You mentioned adult. Right now, the limit for age limit is 16 and older. Maybe you could just briefly speak to vaccines for the pediatric population for mitochondrial disease.
Yeah, so vaccine trials in children are just starting. It's expected those results are going to be several months away. It's probably not going to be a robust trial like the adult trials, just because they're going to be smaller. But we're really interested in safety and whether or not the drug works. I've had conversations with immunologists and other experts that don't feel that there's going to be any backlash to the vaccine in children, but we just don't know until you do the study. By and large, I'm not recommending my pediatric patients get vaccinated until we have some information.
Yeah, and of course, with the vaccines coming on the market, we also have new types of vaccines, these messenger RNA vaccines. There was a question asked, any reason to consider one or the other of the messenger RNA vaccines from Pfizer or from Moderna versus the more traditional viral vector vaccine that may be coming down the road from AstraZeneca and others?
Yeah, so it looks like from the data that we have is that the mRNA vaccines are more effective than the other vaccines that have been tested. But of course, there was one of the vaccines, and I think it was the AstraZeneca, had a very wide range of efficacy. I think 62 to 90%, and the people who got the higher dose of the vaccine had a 90% effective, take on the vaccine process. So that may be just as good as the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine. If you're eligible to get the vaccine, I wouldn't, you get what they have. I wouldn't wait around for another vaccine to show up because we really don't know if or when that's going to happen. So a friend of mine was told he's getting the Pfizer vaccine. 2 days later, I was told I was getting the Moderna vaccine. That's what I took.
Yeah, well, thank you for those answers, Dr. Cohen.
Oh, one more thing, it's worth checking out your state's website. If you go to your state Department of Health, so if I type in Ohio Department of Health COVID-19, it tells you exactly where you would fall on the list of FDA approved. What are you going to get the vaccine in? So in the state of Ohio, healthcare workers were the first line. The second line, interestingly enough, are those older than 75, and partially thanks to the UMDF, if you're in Ohio and have a mitochondrial disease, you would fall into 1B, right behind healthcare workers. So, starting this week, we're starting to immunize 1B patients. which would include mitochondrial disease. Now, that may not be true in Illinois or Kentucky or California. You've got to check it goes state by state. Although it looks like what just happened today is the vaccines are going to flood the market, and the states are going to be told just immunize whoever you can get your hands on. So, they may be trying to get people older than 75, but if you're in line, you're going to get the vaccine.
I guess it's a little uncertain right now, right? What
Right.
the mass distribution is going to look like. And of course, this is another advocacy aspect that UMDF has been very busy with here in the last months, and that's trying to assure that mitochondrial disease patients are prioritized for vaccination. And Dr. Cohen described some of these phases. Phase 1 for the frontline healthcare workers, and then moving into at-risk populations. And so UMDF has contacted all 50 states through their secretaries of health to make the case that mitochondrial disease patients should be prioritized. And again, I want to emphasize, being prioritized does not mean that you should take the vaccine. It's saying if you and your healthcare provider make the decision that you should be vaccinated, you have the opportunity to receive that as soon as possible. And we've received good feedback from many individual states that they appreciated hearing that and have prioritized the mitochondrial disease patients. So I'm sure that's going to be an ongoing effort as well, but it remains unclear. Every state is going to handle it a little bit differently. So Dr. Cohen, it looks like we do have a little bit more time. If we want to continue to talk a little bit about clinical trials, maybe come back to COVID if you like. There have been a number of questions that have been posed through the Q&A feature about, is there something in development for MRF? Is there something in development for MIDD, something for TK2? I think, again, that speaks to the diversity of mitochondrial disease, but in general, are there specific indications where there seems to be more activity or more likely to have drugs developed for them?
Yeah, so right now the trials are based on symptoms of the mitochondrial disease, not the mitochondrial disease itself. So, two symptoms for MRF are muscle myopathy and epilepsy. And so if you happen to be a child who has MRF and has epilepsy, there's a clinical trial that you may be eligible for. If you happen to be an adult with MRF and epilepsy, there's not. But if you're an adult who has MRF and has myopathy, within hopefully a couple of months, there'll be not just one, but probably 2 clinical trials. So right now, the drugs are sort of forming around the epilepsy in children aspect and the weakness in the adult aspect. And there's another company, Phil, that we can talk about offline that wants to tackle both pediatric epilepsy and adult myopathy, and that you don't have up there, but we should. So.
Yeah, well, again, that speaks to the fact that it's changing very rapidly, right? This landscape. And again, I'll just take it as another opportunity to emphasize how important it is that we know who the patients are, where they're located, and have them characterized genotypically and their symptoms as well, so that as these opportunities present themselves, we can quickly enroll those trials. So that's great to hear. There was a question in here that I thought really touched upon sort of the challenge we face in mitochondrial disease space. And someone has made the comparison that, a lot of what you described sounds like what the MS community went through, right? A disease that waxes and wanes, isn't consistent. There were a lot of the same challenges they faced. So what can we learn from MS and their ability to get drugs to market for that particular disease? So
MS, I told you for mitochondrial disease, the FDA doesn't like looking at MRI scans because no one's ever proven the MRI scan actually shows someone's doing better or worse. MS is totally different. The MRI scan is the holy grail in MS. It is a great biomarker for MS. And so the FDA said, for MS, we'll take the MRI scan. If you can show us the drug prevents the MS reoccurrence in the brain on the basis of MRI scan, we'll give you will give you a pass on it. And so the reason drug development in MS took off like crazy over the last 10 or 15 years is because number one, there was a biomarker, and that's the MRI scan. Number two, it's a common disease. There's hundreds of thousands of patients with MS per year. And number three, there's a target, and that's autoinflammation inside the brain, and a whole host of drugs, immunosuppressants, developed strategically, just sort of came falling out of the sky once the scientists had cracked that part of the code. So it's a very different world for MS patients now than it was 30 years ago. And we certainly hope 10 years from now it'll be different for our patients with mitochondrial disease.
There's similarities, but there's important differences as well.
Yep.
That's fair to say. Another question that came out of a Q&A, we speak to this diversity of hundreds of different mitochondrial diseases. There's some that are a result of nuclear DNA mutations, mitochondrial DNA mutations. Everything's complex, right, about mitochondrial disease. Does that mean that every drug is going to have to be highly tailored for each indication? Or are there opportunities perhaps to group some indications together and broadly address some of the most important symptomology to mitochondrial disease patients?
Yeah, so I mentioned the stealth drug seems to work against a particular type of set of nuclear DNA mutations, but not against mitochondrial DNA mutations. And we can hypothesize why it would be that way, but and certainly, it could be chance alone, although it doesn't seem likely based on when you go in and you analyze. So until we start finding nuggets of gold, we're not really gonna know for sure.
Yeah, and I guess the take-home message from that is that there will be some drugs developed of broad utility across many different types of mitochondrial disease, probably because of the type of drug, the mechanism of action. But there are others that are going to be extremely specific. And of course, when we start talking about gene therapies and other type of gene editing techniques, that's the ultimate sort of personalized medicine.
Sure.
It's really
there's a couple. Yeah, there's a couple examples. There's a drug for cystic fibrosis, a terrible lung disease in kids, but it only works in 4% of people with CF based on the genetics. If you turn on the TV, you see a drug that works great against lung cancer, but you got to have these 3 genes, and you can't have that gene. And so it really is personalized. Lung cancer therapy has now become personalized medicine therapy. And if you're unfortunate enough to have lung cancer, but you're fortunate enough to have this, exact matrix of gene mutations, we got a drug for you that's going to keep you alive many, many years. When I say we, I don't treat lung cancer, but it may end up being more individualized than we wish it would be. Right. We wish we just have a drug that we could use. Doesn't look like it's going to be that way.
So there's a question in here about diagnosis. And it occurs to me, this is a really important phase of therapeutic development that we should talk about. Like even the progress that's been made in diagnosing mitochondrial disease patients and how that's changed over the years. One of the questions was, is a muscle biopsy still necessary, or do you move right to genetic testing? So maybe you could just talk about what's the state of the art with regards to diagnosis of mitochondrial disease, because to be clear, you will need a diagnosis of mitochondrial disease to participate in a clinical trial.
Yeah, clinical trials require a genetic diagnosis. And 20 years ago, we rarely were able to make a genetic diagnosis because we didn't have the tool set to get to that genetic diagnosis. What we were using 20 years ago and 30 years ago was muscle biopsy results. As it ends up, the muscle biopsy results don't correlate particularly well with the genetic diagnosis. And if you can get a genetic diagnosis, it's stone cold accurate. So I used to perform 50 or so muscle biopsies per year in my patients. That was this maximum throughput I could do in terms of seeing patients every year. I did not order a muscle biopsy. I think it's been 2 or 3 years since I've ordered a muscle biopsy in any patient. And it wasn't to prove a mitochondrial disease. It was to prove that it was some other type of muscle disease. For the most part, we're going to genetics. When whole exome first came out in 2013, it was a $15,000 test. We can now get a whole exome for under $1,000. Muscle biopsies, out the door were about $50,000 15 or 20 years ago. So the cost of diagnosis has gone way down.
Yeah, and I guess despite that, which is a positive, it's more accessible. We still know that perhaps only half of our mitochondrial disease community have a confirmed genetic diagnosis of mitochondrial disease. So that it really speaks to both the challenge and the opportunity that's still ahead of us to improve diagnosis of mitochondrial disease, and by doing so, improve the likelihood of their participation in clinical trials.
That's a great point.
Yeah. This is something of really high importance to the foundation. We think about this a lot in ways that we can try to facilitate more diagnoses. And I think you'll be hearing more about that as 2021 progresses. But it's absolutely essential that I think everyone that's participating in this call and within our community understands that you will a genetic diagnosis will be required to participate in a clinical trial. And I know that's frustrating for a lot of people that are on that diagnostic journey for a long time, but it's really the only way that trials can be run effectively. Yeah, so I think we're kind of getting some of the same questions coming in now. I don't know if there was any area, Dr. Cohen, that you wanted to kind of finish with, any final comments with regards to where our disease community is with clinical trials. But I open the floor to you for final comments.
We need everyone's participation. Clinical trials are difficult in that, we'll see a patient that on the surface fits into a clinical trial, but just not appropriate because they're not having as many seizures as we thought they were having, or having too many seizures to count. That can keep you out of a clinical trial. There was a question about, what do I do if my mitochondrial disease, it's a terrible disease, but it doesn't make me sick enough to qualify for a clinical trial. And that's just, that's just one of the barriers to drug development in mitochondrial disease. You've got this terrible disease that makes you sick, but not sick enough to qualify for a trial. What a tragedy, that is. But the way trials are designed is to try to get an answer that the FDA will can use to qualify the drug or not. So we found this with the stealth trial, is that some people walked, they had a myopathy, they were weak, but they were able to walk fast enough. And what we found when earlier in the phase 2 study is that if you're able to walk fast already, the drug didn't make you walk any faster. So those patients in the next phase of the study were excluded. If you walk too fast, it didn't make you walk faster. If you walk too slow, it didn't make you walk faster. We were looking for the patients in the middle. And that's one of the really difficult parts of mitochondrial trial design. We don't see that in cancer. You got lung cancer or brain tumor, you're pretty much going to qualify for a clinical trial. And because there was a biomarker question, we do not have blood biomarkers for mitochondrial disease that are disease specific and symptom specific enough that the FDA will use. We have biomarkers, but they're not anything the FDA buys into.
Yeah, but it's an active area of research, and this is something that UMDF through its grant program has supported, is that search for blood-based biomarkers and biomarkers in general. We know that's a really important component of therapeutic development, but it takes time, right, for the research to progress. Not at this point. We don't have those biomarkers. There was also a question quickly about what's the best way to access genetic testing? You necessarily, for a mitochondrial disease patient, do you need to go to a specialist like a neurologist? Or could that be done by a healthcare provider like a pediatrician or a primary care physician?
It really depends on the sophistication of the healthcare provider. So for the most part, if you've got a neurologic disease, you're going to be seeing a neurologist or a geneticist. Those are the people to do that. So I think the best answer to your question is a geneticist. Some of us neurologists feel comfortable to do genetic testing for the diseases that we take care of. Most mitochondrial doctors are neurologists or geneticists, but not exclusively so.
Yeah.
And some pediatricians have become very sophisticated in their abilities to order genetic tests. We have a pediatrician in our group that probably does as much genetic testing as the geneticist. She works with a population of patients that have a high yield with genetic testing. So, and she's very qualified. So it's not really the specialty, it's the comfort that the particular physician or provider has. We have some nurse practitioners that feel very comfortable with genetic testing. They do it well.
Well, Dr. Cohen, we can't thank you enough for making the time this evening to be a part of this webcast. You're taking care of our patients, you're running clinical trials, you're administering at a hospital in the middle of a pandemic. So for you to free up and lend your insights on this important topic, thank you very much for making the time.
There's no place I'd rather be than talking to you guys here tonight, really. I've been around doing this for a long time, and not being able to talk to patients and families has crimped my style. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you. And thanks to everyone that signed up, that participated. Thanks for the many great questions. Again, we did our best to answer as many as we could. Some are very specific and hard to ask in this forum. But a quick reminder that the next Ask the Mito Doc will be on February 16th, and the topic will be COVID-19. So I'm sure there will still be plenty of topics for discussion then, with an esteemed panel that you see on the screen right now. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Be safe, and we'll look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Thank you.